Good morning, internet family. Happy Sunday. It's been a whole week since I've made a video. Trying to be faithful enough to at least do it once a week, even though I'm so busy right now. So I figured I would leave off or pick up where I left off talking to you last week. I did numbers 1 through 7, and I'm sitting here flipping through my pages and pages of notes from, I'm on chapter, I think it's 20 now. 30. Wow. Chapter 30. So that's a lot. That's a lot. And the thing that I noticed for sure that I'm going to speak on is in chapter 11. Israel gets derailed by opinions of people. This is where they asked for meat. God had been giving them manna. Manna is, we call it bread, but it's not anything like anything that we have. Brownie, hush. Anything that we have to eat. It's something that came straight from heaven, and I can imagine it being the only thing that they had to eat, that God would make sure that it had everything they needed. We know that in order to be healthy, we need a balanced diet with all the different food groups and all the different nutrients, and God provided one thing. So we could safely assume that one thing, the manna, had everything they needed in it and sustained them wholly. And it also tells us that the manna was delicious. It was a delicacy, is how the Message translation worded it. So it's not that they were just eating dirt or eating plain, not good tasting, unnutritious, no value to it, bread. They weren't eating saltine crackers and nothing else, basically. They were eating a delicacy that had everything they needed in it. But this is what spoke to me right here. In the Message translation, it calls them the misfits. They started grumbling about having pots of meat in Egypt. Now, we don't see anywhere in Scripture it telling us that they had pots of meat when they were in Egypt. That doesn't mean that they didn't. They may have. But what these misfits are leaving out is, number one, the gratitude for this amazing food that is provided for them literally falls from the sky. I wish that food that would sustain me and nourish me would fall from the sky, where all I had to do was pick it up every day. That would be so easy, especially with the things that I've got in my body, where I have to be mindful of what I eat. It makes it difficult for me to get all the nutrients that I need, and manna would be amazing. But the misfits of the Israelites started grumbling. They wanted meat. They forgot. This is the other thing. They forgot about the beatings, the belittling, the hard labor, just the fact that they didn't even belong to themselves. They forgot about all that and longed for pots of meat that may or may not have even existed even. And forgot about the blessing that it was to have this manna, how delicious it was, how fulfilling it was, how holy everything they needed it was. And these misfits spoke, and the rest of the Israelites allowed them to speak into their lives. So, and the question that I asked myself here is, why do we allow people that we wouldn't want to be like? Because if they're the misfits, if they're the ones that don't fit in, they're the ones that don't belong, and nobody really calls them their best friend because they don't have the qualifications for that. Nobody wants to be like these people, and yet they take their words and make them their own. They allow these misfits to speak into their lives. They allow these misfits' perspective to change their perspective, even though they wouldn't want to be anything like them. So why do we do that? Why do we as people, and when I say we because these are things that I know I struggle with too, or have struggled with, but this is a current thing. I can look at someone else, and I can long after something they have, or long after some character trait that they have, or whatever it is, and I have to remind myself, would I actually want to be like that person? Why do I want to be like them in that if I don't want to be like them in general? Or somebody will say something to me, or say something in general, and I'm like, man, that's not something that I usually think or that I would say, and it makes me feel some type of way about myself, and I have to remind myself I'm not them. Now, would I want to be? anything like them, if this is a person that I would see as a mentor, if this is a person that I would follow in the footsteps of, then maybe I can take what they say to heart. Maybe I can adapt my way of thinking to their way of thinking, because it does line up with the Bible, and I do admire where they are in their life and who they are as a person in Christ. But if I can't say all that about them, then I have to remember that what they say doesn't actually matter to me. Unless the Lord himself convicts me through their words, then their words don't actually matter to me, unless they are somebody that I would want to be anything like. Why do we let people speak into our lives that we don't want to be a big part of our life, that we don't want to our lives to mirror their life? It's a really good question. And still talking about the meat, and still in chapter 11. Have you ever heard of having too much of a good thing? So God gave them meat. God listened to their cries. God gave them what they wanted. And here's the funny thing about it, is he gave them so much of what they wanted that they were overwhelmed with it. He sent so many quail that I can imagine how bad that stank, for one thing. And just how much, you think of, if you really, really think about these things in the Bible, when you read them instead of just reading them and like, that's kind of crazy, okay, whatever, move on. You think about the plagues in Egypt, all the frogs and all that, but you think about that many quail. Ugh. That's a lot of chaos, a lot of birds flying around. You think of, who was it, maybe Edgar Allan Poe that wrote The Birds? It just sounds a little insane, and then they're all dying and it's all stinky, and then they have all their meat and they have too much of it, and everyone who ate the meat died. And that's what they get for being ungrateful. Now let's see what else I've got in this, so many chapters. In chapter 12, we see some of the people, that's my dog, some of the people talking about Moses and Aaron behind their back. And they don't vindicate themselves. In fact, the Lord calls them out. They don't find out about it until God tells them about it. And God was angry. And God would have killed them. But instead of allowing God to do that, they stuck up for these people. And I found that really beautiful. That touched my heart. Because number one, God has our back. God will fight for us. When we are living for God, when we are kingdom minded, and not focused on ourselves, God's going to fight for us. God's going to defend us, period. Whatever that may look like, it's going to be different in every situation, but he's going to fight all of the battles for us. And that doesn't just mean no wars. That means when people talk about us behind our back, he will defend us. And then the way that they responded, so humble. That's the way that he wants us to be. That's the way that Jesus was. And are we not called to be as much like Jesus as we possibly can be? So next we have Joshua and Caleb and the other 10 spies. And this, again, is where people speak into a whole group of people, a whole nation. And I wonder, these are leaders from the tribes. So it's not so much like the misfits again, but the 10, I'm not even going to try to read them. I've got them written here, but I'm not going to try to read them because I probably can't pronounce them right. I did find it fascinating that Joshua's original name was Hoshea, and Joshua means God saves. So these 12 spies go in and they bring back these grapes. It took 2 men to carry one bunch of grapes. Can you imagine grapes that big? Oh my goodness. But the grapes were only as big, proportionately as the people there, which is fitting. And 10 of them came back defeated. They came back looking at the natural circumstances, the natural evidence of what they had found, and they were defeated already in their hearts and in their minds, and they spread that. It was like a disease that spread through Israel, the people group. But Joshua and Caleb, they saw all this. It's not that they weren't connected to reality. It's just that they remembered what God said. So, and that's what we have to do. There are circumstances that so many of the people I care about right now are up against, and circumstances that I am up against, not in my life, but in my own internal being, that I look at and I'm defeated by. I'm absolutely defeated by. And then I remember, but God said, Jeremiah 29:11, he has good things for us, good plans for us. 2 Timothy 1:7, for he's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. Everybody's got their own scriptures that they call on to remember the promises, but God said. And God had told the Israelites that this was their land. He was sending them into the land of milk and honey. This was their promised land. He was going to care for them. He was going to provide for them. This was going to be like their heaven on earth. And Joshua and Caleb looked at that. They remembered the promise. They remembered the promise as being the reality. So even though they had this tangible evidence of what was up, they were up against, they remembered the promise. And to them, the promise was as solid as what they were looking at, if not more solid. To everyone else, it just wiped it out. They forgot completely about the promise of God and turned into just relying on the world. And the world's going to fail us. The world's going to let us down. And the world is going to defeat us if we don't remember that it's not just us. It wasn't just Israel. It wasn't just the 12 spies up against these giants and up against all these other peoples that they were coming against to claim their promised land. It was them and God. Them and the God and his armies. Joshua and Caleb remembered that. Everyone else forgot. And so since they forgot, and this is so important. Bill Johnson, I can't quote him exactly, but he put something in my mind a long time ago that really resonated. God's going to keep his promise as long as we maintain it. So if he makes a promise, but we don't do the things necessary for him to keep that promise, he's not going to force it on us. So in them refusing to go forward and to walk in that promise, God said, okay, I'll just give it to your children then. And that's actually really devastating. It is so devastating. Let's see what else I've got. If there's anything worth talking about. I love reading about the sacrifices. All the many, it's so tedious. It really is tedious. But, this time around reading through it, I've paid attention to each thing. And I found so much in the sacrifices. I think last week I shared with you about how the sacrifices were the same for each person. It's because it's not God, it's not people that the sacrifice is based upon, it's God. So, and since God remains the same and God is always worthy and God is always just as good and just awe-inspiring, that the sacrifice to him should remain the same, no matter how big, how many, how important the people. That still is always going to stick with me. But I noticed in one of the 20-something chapters that there's a whole meal. There's whole meals being offered as sacrifices. The drinks, the bread, the meat, all of this. And I thought about how, okay, so these people are maintaining God's gift. They are shepherding their flocks, feeding their flocks, taking care of their crops. They're making the drink, the beer, whatever it is, and all of these other things out of these things that they've maintained. But ultimately, God is what provided. God is who provided these things for them. Without the provision of God and the gifts of God, they wouldn't have had anything to do any of these offerings with. And I also took big note of the Lord telling Moses to tell the people that it is their responsibility to come to him and make these sacrifices at the designated time on the designated day. Now, there's not really a designated time and day for us to do things now, but nonetheless, it is our responsibility to make time. It is our responsibility to make room. How can we expect to hear from God? How can we expect for our lives to even honor God in any way if we're not setting aside time for him? If we're not making a deliberate point of spending time with him, giving him an offering, maintaining what he gives us in order to have something to give him. And I thought it was beautiful that he gave them all these things and taught them how to maintain them and grow them in such a way that they were able to give God a full meal, which in turn fed them a full meal. I thought that was beautiful. Oh, there's so much. I really want to encourage all of you to dig in like this, like you're in your own way. Pray for understanding and just dig into the books of the Bible that maybe you haven't been able to get into before, that maybe haven't spoken to your heart before, because this is life-changing. A Talking Donkey. I absolutely loved reading chapters 22 and 23, I believe is what it was. Yeah. That's where Balaam, he is a prophet. he has a donkey, and the donkey spoke to him. The people of another nation were trying to wipe out Israel, and they wanted Balaam to come and prophesy against Israel, to curse them. So Balaam says no, because God told him no the first time they sent somebody to bring him to them. And the second time God said, well, since they're here, go ahead. But don't tell them anything except for what I tell you to tell them. And so he gets on his faithful donkey, that he'd had for years, rides this donkey, and the donkey keeps seeing the angel of the Lord. And this is where it really struck me. So as they're on their way to this other nation where they're trying to get Balaam to curse Israel for them, I think the Lord saw a shift in Balaam's heart, is what it was, because Balaam was doing what God had said. God said go with them. But the angel of the Lord with the sword came, and the donkey saw this angel and stopped. And this happened 3 times. And the third time is when the donkey spoke. Balaam was beating his donkey every time, trying to get the donkey to get back on the road, because it kept like sideswiping him and going off in ditches and all kinds of stuff. And the angel finally spoke the third time after the donkey had spoken and said, I would have killed you if it weren't for your donkey. Your donkey is not the reason that any of this is happening. Your donkey is basically a good donkey. Why was God sending the angel to stop him if he was doing what he said? Because he saw his heart. He saw in his heart that he was about to do something wicked. He saw in his heart that his intentions were changing. The Bible didn't tell me that, but I believe that's what happened, because why else would God stop him and then continue to allow him to go? So Balaam stood his ground and blessed Israel, making some people very, very angry. So I noticed there's some feasts that happen. Just there's so many festivals and so many feasts. I honestly can't remember all the names of them right now as I'm reading over through my notes. But there was some that happened one day, and then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, progressively for many days. And I noticed that the day 1, I think it was 10 days. Day 1, there was 10 bulls and a bunch of other animal sacrifice. And as the days got bigger in number, the number of animals sacrificed got smaller in number. And what the Lord spoke to me through this is that, okay, so sanctification is a little by little, day by day, step by step purification process. That's what happens to us as a believer as we walk closer and closer to God, grow more mature in God, learn more, and I don't mean knowledge, I mean wisdom. And our relationship with the Lord grows stronger. Our discipleship, we disciple more because we've been discipled more. All of these things. And I noticed the sacrifice is getting smaller as the numbers of the days getting bigger. And that reminded me of how, and I really honestly hate talking about us making sacrifices, like laying down our fleshly desires is really even a sacrifice. But it does feel like it is. It really feels like it is. Changing our lives, especially if you're coming from a lifestyle like, where I came from, addiction and completely selfish and all these other things, it was me, and all these worldly things that just filled my life to the fullest. It wasn't full. It was just, it was, so it felt like a sacrifice. Every time I was laying something down that I really didn't need to have anyways, it felt like I was laying down my whole life. So I was reminded how, as I've walked with the Lord more and more, as I've been with Him longer and longer, and as we get closer and closer, and as I seek Him more and more, and as I have this bigger hunger, it's like the sacrifices get smaller. The things that I'm sacrificing get less and less, and the weight of the things I'm sacrificing get less and less, because as I keep doing this, as I've remained persistent, as I've been committed and kept with it, and I've not went back and done it all over again the way that I used to, it's like there's not as much to sacrifice anymore. And that's not what that passage is talking about, but that's what the Lord said to me through it. He just reminded me how it does get easier. But then I was also reminded, and this is so true for me, how these festivals and these feasts happened every year. It was once a year for each and every single one of them. It was part of their calendar. And I'm reminded how it seems like every time I do something, every time I sacrifice something, I say that, but every time I lay something down, it's like an amount of time rolls back around, and there I am doing it again. I'm laying the same or similar things back down. I'm having to be purified and cleansed and sanctified from the same things that He's already cleansed me of before. And it's not that I've went back and used drugs. It's not that I've went back to that old selfish lifestyle, but it's like all this stuff, this junk gets back in me, and I don't think that's abnormal. I think that's something we all do. And I think that's why he set up these offerings and these sacrifices and these feasts to happen on a regular basis, to be cycled through the calendar, because he knows. He knows human nature, and he knows the nature of the world. He knows we get sucked back in, and he knows that we suck things back into us, unaware that we're doing it, and that we just get filled up with all this junk, and this junk creates distance between us and him. And laying these things down and sacrificing these things to him brings us closer to him again, like we had already done before, and like we'll have to do again later on down the road. But as we continue to do it, as we go through these cleansing and purifying processes, by laying these things down and sacrificing our lives to the Lord, we get closer and closer to him, and we just get to, it's not that we have to, it's that we get to do it over and over and over again, because he's just that good. He's just that patient. He's just that understanding. He's just that kind. And he wants us that much that he wants us to keep doing that, to be close to him. That's all I've got. I sure hope so. After 20-something minutes, you guys have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of your weekend, and I love you all.